Good morning, New York Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. All right, another miserable New York Giants loss on Sunday to the Chicago Bears. Yet another victory turned into defeat by your New York Giants, as I wrote on Big Blue View this morning. That seems to be what this New York Giants team does best. And here to help me talk about Brian Daboll, about the misery that is the 2025 Giants right now, is Big Blue View's Tony DelGenio. Tony, morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Ed.
Here we go again, huh? Another game,
Yeah,
another game the Giants should have won, another game they could have won, another game that they didn't win, and basically that they where it was a self-inflicted loss. And let's cut right to the chase, Tony. Let's not beat around it here. Let's just say we have to talk about Brian Daboll's future as head coach of the Giants. I wrote this morning that his time is running out. Basically, my view on this is the Brian Daboll era is over. Okay. The question is, does it end today? Does it end a couple of weeks from now at the bye? Does it end at the end of the season? The Brian Daboll era is over, and the Giants, it's clear Daboll has no answers to whatever it's going to take to turn this Giants around and get them to stop losing games that they should win. It's also clear to me that yes, he drafted Jaxson Dart. Yes, he has a reputation of developing quarterbacks. Yes, he and Dart have a good reputation. But it's crystal clear to me that Jaxson Dart is more likely to get broken by Brian Daboll than developed by Brian Daboll, and that Dable just isn't the right guy to shepherd Jaxson Dart into the future. So let's start there.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll preface my thoughts by saying that back in 2022, I was thrilled with the Brian Daboll hire. I thought he was exactly the right guy for them to hire, and I thought that was borne out by his first season as Giants head coach, where he took a team that had looked inept and got them to the playoffs and got them to the second round of the playoffs. And they had a dynamic offense, and they were going for it and winning games, and everything looked fine. But since then, he just seems to have collapsed. And to me, 2025 Brian Daboll is not the same coach that 2022 Brian Daboll was, for whatever reason, whether he just is shell shocked by by what's happened over the last few years or whatever. And I just think he's out of answers right now, given his capabilities. And I get that the Giants ownership doesn't like to get rid of head coaches in mid-season, and they like to wait till the end of the year to do it. But I really feel that now would be the time to make a change. And you have an offensive coordinator sitting on your staff who's been trying to get head coaching jobs the last year or two, and has been a good soldier staying there. And even though he had the play calling taken away from him, 1 year, and so on and so forth, I think you give Mike Kafka a chance for the second half of the season just to show what he's capable of doing, and to maybe do things a little differently, and see what given the composition of the roster and who's healthy, what you can possibly do. And I think it shakes things up a little bit and gets the players' attention. And I think that at the same time it can be a little bit of a tryout for him to see whether he might be the guy to go with going forward, or whether he's as much to blame for their collapse as Dable is. The thing that strikes me more than anything about Dable is how conservative a head coach he has become. And I really feel like in the NFL you're not rewarded by being too cautious, and especially with a roster that has holes in it like the Giants. You kind of have to take your shots to win the game when you see it within reach, and he's not doing that. And so I I don't actually expect him to be fired this week, but if I were the one making the decision, I would fire him this week.
I tend to agree with you, Tony. I do not think Dable's getting fired today. I will admit that, as we do our live stream here at about 10 after 9 in the morning, I will admit that I am scrolling Twitter and constantly updating and keeping an eye on that to make sure that that Brian Daboll doesn't get fired in the middle of our show. Or if he does, to make sure that that we discuss it. But look, Chris Chianese asked, as in the comments, he said, we've talked, and I wrote last week about accountability, and Chris said, if someone isn't fired today, who is holding Daboll and his staff accountable? And the answer to that is right now, nobody. And look, the deal is Brian Daboll, as a face-saving, last-ditch job-saving move, could go ahead and fire Shane Bowen today, but what's the point? What's the point if he wasn't going to fire him in the offseason when John Mara gave him an opening? What's the point if he wasn't going to fire him after the Dallas game? What's the point if he wasn't going to fire Bowen after the Denver game, when it might still have been early enough in the season to make an impact, to really change the defense to in a way that might have made a difference this season? What's the point at this point other than to give the media and the fan base a pound of flesh and to make it look like he's doing something to save his job? In reference to Dable losing his job himself, I agree that I don't expect him to lose his job today. I certainly think, though, that one factor that you have to that has to weigh into this is, look, how much ugliness have we seen at MetLife Stadium the last couple of years? The Giants have a home game this Sunday. They're 2-8 again. They're 11-33 over the last 3 years. I think they have a 366. I think they're 20-40-1 in Dable's time as head coach. How ugly is it going to be at MetLife Stadium on Sunday if nothing changes on this coaching staff? If nothing is done, and I think that is the one thing, because I know John Mara cares about what people think. I know he cares about the fan base. You can chuckle about the whole medium Pepsi thing if you want to, but I know he cares about the opinions of the fan base. I think that that's the one factor that might get Giants ownership to make a change, is just to avoid some of the ugliness at MetLife Stadium for the rest of the year. I wouldn't mind seeing Mike Kafka get an opportunity for a few games. And look, if you're going to give him an opportunity, give him the longest runway you can give him. Don't give him 3 games. Give him 7 games. Give him a real runway to show you what he can do as a head coach, and whether or not he can change the quote unquote accountability factor with this Giants team, because for me, that's the biggest issue. It's no one seems to be accountable. Players tried to say it's on the players to be better last night, but who's holding their feet to the fire and making them be better? I don't see anybody doing that, because I don't see anybody losing jobs. I don't see anybody being called out for underperforming. And, the reality of it is I just don't see anything changing. And I don't think it's going to change until changes are made in the coaching staff. I just don't.
Yeah, and I guess I agree with all of that. The only thing I would say is that if it were me making the decision, I would get rid of Shane Bowen too right now, because all of these terrible losses that they've had have been games where the defense collapsed in the fourth quarter. And I guess I'm not there with the players. I don't know what the players think of Bowen. They don't, to my knowledge, say bad things about him to the press. And maybe if I had the pulse of the defensive players in the locker room, then I'd have a better feel for whether they're frustrated by Bowen or not. I mean, I think you can certainly infer things like the way Brian Burns acted going back to the locker room after the Denver loss and things like that. That make you think that they're not too crazy about the way he's calling defenses late in games, and his non-aggressiveness as a defensive coordinator. I think the only problem with getting rid of Shane Bowen right now is I don't see unlike on the offensive side where you could imagine promoting Kafka to head coach, someone who's been looking to be a head coach, doing interviews, and he could still be head coach and kind of quasi offensive coordinator at the same time, although that's not necessarily the best arrangement. But I don't know who takes over if you get rid of Shane Bowen. I mean, they have respected guys like Andre Patterson or Manuel, and but I'm not sure whether either of them would be a good fit in a coordinator position. I don't know. That's something that's above my pay grade. However, just as something to acknowledge the seriousness of what's going on that defense, which, unlike the offense, is completely underperforming its talent level. I mean, that's the thing about this team. Okay, on offense, yeah, the Giants don't score as many points as you'd like them to, but you know what? That's a functional offense, and when you consider that their two best offensive weapons really are out with injuries, they're still moving the ball, they're still scoring points, and they've got a quarterback who just looks tremendous for a rookie. I mean, I can't tell you how surprised in the positive direction I've been with how good Jaxson Dart looks as a rookie. And so their problem is not the offense right now, it's the defense. And so I think I'd like to see anyway them make a move on defense to get a different defensive philosophy into the locker room. And I don't know that any of these things actually matter in the long run. You're midway through a season that's lost anyway, and we're into the tankathon checking part of the season that Giants fans are always in by midseason. And they've got the number 3 pick now. But I do think you could at least acknowledge to the fans. I mean, you referenced, this coming Sunday where Green Bay's gonna be coming in, and I'm sure MetLife is gonna look very green and gold and not very blue on Sunday with all the Packers fans. But you've got to do something, I think, to acknowledge to Giants fans that yeah, it's not acceptable to us either, and here's how we're going to try to be accountable, at least in the moment.
Absolutely. In reference to Shane Bowen, he got killed against Dallas for being too conservative. He got killed against Denver for, again, playing a conservative coverage. To his credit, yesterday, I thought at the end of that game, he was aggressive. I did think they sent pressure. They sent blitzes. I haven't seen the percentage of times that they rushed extra people at Caleb Williams. They just weren't successful. And we've reached a point with this coaching staff where it seems like whatever button they push is one that doesn't work. And that's, that's the issue right now, is they're just out of answers.
Yeah, and in that regard, and I know this is the least likely thing to happen, but uh, if it were me, I would be getting rid of Joe Shane right now too, because I feel like that's on him, and I think Joe Shane has done a number of good things as general manager, and the impression that I get from everything I read is that his job is much safer than Daboll's job is, and you could argue that as GM he should have the chance. He's done enough good things that as GM you should give him the chance to select another head coach for the team. But I also feel that he has a philosophy of how he builds the team that is out of sync with what has happened to the NFL in terms of what lengths you go to get yourself a good roster. And he's a much more conservative as a GM than you can afford to be in today's NFL. And so if I were doing it, I would make a clean sweep across the board, and then just have a completely new set of people in charge at both the GM level and the head coach level going into next season. But that's just me, and I realize that's the least probable thing that will happen.
Well, since you went there, we'll go to the Joe Shane discussion. I tend to agree with you that there have been issues, there have been mistakes made by Joe Shane. Okay. But I look at it this way, and it's funny because Chris Flum and I were having this discussion earlier this morning, because I think Chris is on your side. Okay. And I said, look, if you think that coaching cost the Giants 4 games this season, in-game management by the coaching staff, by the defensive coordinator, by the head coach, if you think, as I do, that in-game decision-making cost the Giants those 4 games, then you're looking at a 2-8 team that should be 6-4. And if you believe, as I do, that the Giants should be 6-4, maybe 7-3, if they beat the 49ers, which they were capable of beating the 49ers, and it just didn't happen, then how do you fire the GM? If the GM has put together a team that should be a winning team in a playoff fight, and yes, it's taken a while to get there, and I will say this, I did about a year ago a look at the good and the bad of what Joe Shane has done as GM. I will be doing that again. I will go farther, into with all of this here. But if you believe that the Giants should be 6-4 or 7-3, then it's very difficult to fire a general manager who has put together a roster that should be that good, that should be good enough to be in the playoff race, if not leading for a playoff spot.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair argument to make. I as I say, he's done good things, right? And my I think my problem with Joe Shane, it's a weird thing, but it's more at the bottom of the roster than the top of the roster that I object to what Shane has done. And so I get, for the big things. I mean, I don't know why the Giants drafted Jaxson Dart, moved up to get Jaxson Dart. What you read is that Brian Daboll really wanted him so much that he wanted Shane to draft him at number 3. And I'm glad they didn't draft him at number 3, because that's, you knew that they didn't have to do that if they could swing a trade later on. And so, how much of the Giants' offensive success this year is due to the fact that Jaxson Dart just happens to have been, remarkable for a rookie, and for a rookie who wasn't all that highly touted. That's the other thing. Right. Some rookies come in and knock it out of the park right away, but usually the guys that do that are guys that you thought were going to be really good anyway. Jaxson Dart was someone who is considered a second round value, and so it's amazing to me. My problem with Joe Shane is, and I don't blame Joe Shane for the Evan Neal draft pick. I think that was exactly the right draft pick to make at that point in the draft, right? So I don't blame him for the Kayvon Thibodeau draft pick, and Kayvon Thibodeau has turned out to be a good player, just not a good enough player that you're happy having taken him at number 5. I thought that Deonte Banks pick was what Wink Martindale wanted, and he gave up just a little to move up one spot. I thought that was fine too at the time. I thought Jalen Hyatt was perfectly justified in the 3rd round. So I thought all of those things were good moves when they were done. My issue with Joe Shane, and what I really don't understand about things is now that guys like Neal and Banks and Hyatt just have been shown not to have it, or at least not to have it within the Giants system for doing things, why are they still on the roster? And so, those are the things that really puzzle me. And the way he handles the bottom of the roster, the way he handles the finances, the void year question, and things like that, are just things that I think are limiting the team as well. And that's why I would get rid of him. And the other thing that I saw mentioned in one that Chris mentions in the comments here, is they do have Brandon Brown sitting there. And I don't know how good Brandon Brown actually is, and whether inside the building Brandon Brown is thought to be actual GM material. But if he is, then you have somebody sitting there that you could elevate to the position for the rest of the season, and see how he does. So I'm less adamant about the idea of Shane going than Dable, but I think if I were the one making the decision, I would probably do both of them at the same time.
And Tony, there's a good argument for that, because I get it. Dan Hatman, who runs the scouting academy, former NFL scout, worked briefly for the Giants. Dan, whenever I talk to him about this topic, he always says the best way to do this is to have the head coach and the general manager on the same timeline, to have them come in together, to have them go out together. Because what happens at times, and Dan is right about this, what happens at times is if you have a head coach and a general manager on different timelines, as the Giants had, for example, with Dave Gettleman and Joe Judge, what you eventually have is guys who can have different agendas, different timelines, can see things different ways. And then what you wind up with is one or the other or both walking into the owner's office and saying, well, such and such is the other guy's fault. And that's not tenable. Okay. So the argument is that it's always best, whenever possible, to have both of these guys on the same timeline. So I certainly get that. If you think there's enough water under the bridge to move on from Joe Shane, then you do that. My biggest question, and I think I wrote this the other day at Big Blue View. I know Brandon Brown's reputation from Philly. I know that Joe Shane has loved Brandon Brown's work. I know Giants fans kind of romanticize the idea of just elevating Brandon Brown because it's like the backup quarterback, okay? Unless it's Russell Wilson, all right? Unless it's Russell Wilson, everybody loves the backup quarterback more than the starter, okay? So it's sort of like Brown is the backup GM. My question is this. I know that Brandon Brown has a big voice in the Giants front office. I know that, Joe talks to him all the time. What decisions have been made that Brandon Brown agreed with? What didn't he agree with? What has he recommended? How different would the Giants look if Brandon Brown were making those decisions? Maybe ownership isn't even sure of that. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe ownership isn't even sure. Maybe only Brandon Brown and Joe Shane know the answer to that. But if ownership thinks that Brandon Brown maybe would not have made some of the mistakes that Joe has made, if ownership thinks the Giants would be in a better place with Brandon Brown, then fine. But like I said, I would like to know the answer to that question. What has he agreed with? What hasn't he agreed with? What decisions would he have made? And I don't want him to sit there in an interview now and second guess. What you want to know is when he was sitting in Joe Shane's office and they decided to move on from Saquon Barkley, which side of the argument was he on? When they decided to pay Daniel Jones, which side of the argument was he on? When they decided to trade Leonard Williams, which side of the argument was he on? When they decided to draft certain guys, which side of the argument was he on? So that's what you want to know. And and we don't know any of that for sure. There's a comment in there that Brandon Brown wanted Shedeur Sanders, and we don't know that for a fact. We know that Brandon Brown spent a lot of time in Colorado. We know Joe Shane spent a lot of time in Colorado. I think if you had asked the Giants last December, last January, what quarterback they thought they might end up with in the draft, I think they might have said Shedeur Sanders, but Brian Daboll hadn't gotten involved in the scouting process at that point yet. The coaching staff hadn't gotten involved. So we don't know if that's the guy that they wanted. So, and we probably will never know. But that's my question about Brandon Brown is where did he stand on all of these decisions that got made?
Yeah. And I guess there's no way for us to know from the outside the answer to that. What I will say about the Giants right now, if they get rid of head coach and or GM, one or both, and so on. Unlike in previous years where I said I thought to myself, well, who would want to take this job? But if I'm a potential head coach or GM on the outside and I'm looking in at the Giants, I'm saying to myself, there's talent there. It's like you got Dart on the roster, you got Scadaboo, you got Neighbors, you've got Abdul Carter, you got Brian, and it's like that's a team that is not lacking in high-end talent anymore. I think the middle to bottom of the roster really needs to be filled out with more talent, and that's one of the things that's holding them back right now. But I gotta think that this is a fairly attractive position for someone who wants to be a head coach, or a GM, depending on how many positions they want to fill next season. So in that sense, I'm kind of optimistic about things, and that I don't think they have to go take a Joe Judge, let's say, for example. Okay, someone who was just plucked out of thin air and nobody imagined him being a head coach. I think they can go get someone fairly prominent and experienced to be a head coach and or a GM, depending on whether one or both positions need to be filled next season. So I'm optimistic about that. But I do think some change needs to be made very soon, and whether it is just getting rid of Shane Bowen, or whether it is getting rid of Dable, or whether it's getting rid of all three of them, I think some change at the top needs to be made very soon, and I don't know why this is not the right week to do it.
Yeah, I tend to agree that something has to be done. I wrote about accountability last week. Dan Duggan of The Athletic wrote about the lack of accountability. Others have written about the lack of accountability. The answers that just keep coming are, oh, we're working hard at it. We're trying. It's collective, yada, 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 yada. And Deontay Banks keeps getting run out there. Okay. And Abdul Carter still doesn't have a sack, although he should have had one yesterday. But the defense, no matter how they play, keeps collapsing in the fourth quarter. I mean, they were aggressive yesterday, but you watch those Giants pass rushers. They were running at Caleb Williams, and give Caleb Williams some credit for having some escapability. But those guys were running at Caleb Williams like they had never seen a quarterback before or had a chance to hit a quarterback before, with a complete lack of fundamental discipline. They were just flying at that guy as fast as they could, without any regard to, I got to make sure he doesn't fly around the corner and get away from me, or how about we use proper tackling technique and bring this guy down instead of just flail at him with one arm. Dexter Lawrence didn't even make the stat sheet yesterday. Somebody has to, and you don't necessarily have to do it publicly. You don't have to trash a player publicly, but somebody has to say, guys are not doing the jobs as well as they can do them. Somebody has to do that. And if nobody's going to do that, you need to find somebody who will.
Yeah.
Because I think that players are talking about, oh, it's on us, it's on us, it's on us. And, oh, we need to study harder. We need to do this. We need to do that. Well, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to do that. I think all of this, the fruits of what we're seeing right now were laid in the off season. They were laid in the past couple of seasons, in just the way that things have been done. I like Brian Daboll as a person. Okay, I really do. I like Brian Daboll as a person. I think away from the podium, where he does his best Bill Belichick impersonation, which, I'll be brutally honest with you, does him zero favors, because he's not Bill Belichick. Brian Daboll would be better served to stand up there at the podium and be himself and share a little bit more information, and not be quite so standoffish in the way that he answers some questions. But Brian Daboll is not a guy who really, he's not Bill Parcells. Players don't fear anything from Brian Daboll. I don't think. They just, Brian Daboll's just the coach, and he's just there, and guys do their jobs, and Daboll does his job, and whatever the results are, and they just shrug and they move on to the next week. There's nobody really pounding the table and saying these guys need to be better, or at least going to guys privately and saying, you need to be better. You're not playing up to the standard you've set for yourself or whatever. And so some sort of change is is definitely necessary. And Tony, let's spin to the next head coach part of the discussion. I made a list last week, lots of names on it. Some names people liked, some names they didn't like. Bill Belichick was not on that list. Talked to Gary Myers, longtime NFL columnist who knows Belichick really, really well. Gary said that Bill Belichick would take the job in a second. Said that John Mara has a good relationship with Bill Belichick. Doesn't know if he'd hire him, but so you've got to sort of keep it. You got to sort of keep that in mind. My belief is this: whether it's Bill Belichick, whether it's I'll throw out the name Mike McCarthy, because whether people like the name or not, Mike McCarthy has a Super Bowl ring. He has an awful lot of double-digit win seasons to his credit. He has an outstanding NFL head coaching resume. And again, I don't know if he's the right guy. It doesn't sound inspiring. Let's put it that way. But my belief is that the Giants can't go down the hot coordinator who's never done it road again. My belief is they need to find somebody who walks in the door with credibility, with not necessarily Super Bowl rings, but with the ability to say, I've been there, I've done it, I know how it works, and with credibility when he walks in the door. So that's where I stand. Just what are your thoughts on the next head coach?
So I agree with that, and that was really, although I didn't say so, but that's part of the reason that I was saying a couple of minutes ago that the Giants look like a fairly attractive destination for someone who wants to be the head coach, because I feel like the talent level is there now. And so, if the talent level is what it was back in 2020, you're scrounging around to find someone who's willing to take the job, and so you hire some inexperienced person to do it. But I feel like someone who's got some chops already as a head coach would look at the Giants roster as it stands and say, yeah, there are holes we need to fill, but oh man, there's a lot on this team that I can work with. They've got the quarterback in place. They got their wide receiver in place. They got their pass rushers in place. There's a lot already in the kitchen on this team, and they just need coaching and a few more good draft picks or trades or free agent signings, and this team can be a contender. And so I don't feel like they have to settle for some young guy who's never done it before, who's just looking for a position anywhere to start his head coaching career. I feel like they can get an experienced head coach, and even a prominent experienced head coach. So yeah, I don't know how I feel about McCarthy, but that type of coach, someone who's been there, done it. I would not be a fan of Belichick coming back, because I just think his time maybe has passed as a head coach, and I feel like he brings his own circus with him, and I don't want someone like that as the head coach. I want someone who's not going to be the headline guy. I want someone who's a good communicator. You have to find the type of guy who the players respect, but don't necessarily kind of fear all the time. So like early Tom Coughlin was not the right head coach, and it took him 3 years to kind of figure out that he was doing things the wrong way, and to lighten up a little bit and to establish a better relationship with his players. Then he became a great head coach for the Giants. Okay, Parcells was someone who was very gruff and would yell at people a lot, but I think the players knew they could yell right back at him, And people like Phil Simms especially did. Phil Simms gave Parcells as much grief as Parcells gave him. LT when Parcells yelled at him for rushing the passer when it wasn't the play that was called in practice. LT said to him, "Well, that should be in the playbook because it's a good play," And so I think you need someone that commands respect, but that the players can feel that they can have a dialogue with, and that it's not just being run the way a drill sergeant would run things. And that's the type of guy that I'd be looking for. And who that guy should be, I don't know. I mean, a few weeks ago, people were talking about the possibility that John Harbaugh may not be back as Ravens head coach next year, and the first thing that came to mind was, well, if John Harbaugh is not coming back next year, bring him over here. Well, I'd take John Harbaugh in a minute. Okay, but I think that's the type of guy you have to look for as a head coach right now, not a first timer.
I know. I got it. The Giants should just hire Tom Coughlin. They should just, they should just bring Coughlin back. He's still got the energy. I mean, in all seriousness, I kid about that. I kid. Please don't think that Tom's, I think, 78 years old now. I don't think he probably wants to do this, but I do believe they need somebody who commands respect, who players can look at and say, we know he's done this. And I mean, we're not talking about a Pat Shurmur style retread who failed somewhere else and who we think deserves a second opportunity. We're talking about somebody who's had enough success that they bring credibility in the door with them. They don't have to walk in and establish it. They bring it with them. So that's
just as important, I was going to say, is then who that person brings in as coordinators. And so if I ask myself, is Nick Sirianni a great head coach? I'm not convinced that Nick Sirianni is a great head coach per se, but obviously he's got a GM who brings him all the talent in the world, but Nick Sirianni is able to bring in someone like Vic Fangio as his defensive coordinator. All right. And so a head coach or an organizational situation that allows you to bring in really good people as your defensive coordinator or offensive coordinator, I think is as important or almost as important as who the head coach himself actually turns out to be.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, to use the Pat Shurmur example, if you go back to Shurmur's time as Giants head coach, the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues that Shurmur had, was that no top tier assistant coaches wanted to come and work for him. The Giants, when it came to an offensive line coach, they scratched to find one. And they basically wound up pulling Hal Hunter out of retirement because nobody else would take the job. And Hal Hunter, with a long, indistinguished track record as an offensive line coach, they couldn't, and I know this story from years ago, they couldn't find and couldn't agree on a defensive coordinator. And I cannot remember who Pat Shurmur finally wanted to hire, but I know that Dave Gettleman overruled him and hired James Betcher, which didn't work out really well anyway. But that was the biggest problem that Pat Shurmur had with the New York Giants, was that a lot of top tier coaches just didn't want to come to New York and work for Shurmur because they knew what his tenure was in Cleveland. And a lot of those guys knew that hitching their wagon to Pat Shurmur probably wasn't going to work out well. Yeah. So we'll see what happens, but I would like to see the other factor here, Tony, real quickly. The other factor is the Giants just played the Chicago Bears, who hired Ben Johnson, who that looks like it's working out really well for the Bears with Ben Johnson as a first-time head coach. But there isn't a Ben Johnson out there this year. If you look at Ben Johnson, yes, he's a first-time head coach moving up from coordinator, but Ben Johnson has been acknowledged as as the next guy for several years now. He's not a guy. There are some coordinators out there whose names are popping up that hadn't popped up before. Ben Johnson's a guy who's been looking for the opportunity he wanted for several years now. He's been acknowledged as being ready. I don't see one of those guys out there right now in the coordinator ranks.
Yeah. And I was going to say, that is one of the frustrating things I think about Brian Daboll is that Brian Daboll was able to lure some good guys to the coaching staff during his time there, right? I mean, so he was able to get Wink as defensive coordinator, and again, there are obviously pros and cons with Wink, and there was a whole behind the scenes politics and stuff like that going on. But in terms of being a capable defensive coordinator, he certainly was that. He was able to get Andre Patterson to come over from Minnesota. And he was able to bring in Carmen Brasilla, who I think has done a great job with the offensive line. And so that to me is part of the frustration as to why the Giants aren't better, is that I thought he actually brought in some good people in different positions for the coaching staff, and you'd hope that whoever they get is someone who will have enough clout to get good coaches to come in with him. I agree with you. I don't see another Ben Johnson out there. The other thing I would say about Ben Johnson taking the Bears position is that the Bears had a boatload of high draft picks from trades that Ryan Poles had made. I'm not convinced that Ryan Poles is a great GM at all. I think he's made plenty of mistakes as a GCM, and things that he would have been crucified for if he were the Giants GM, like trading a second round pick for Chase Claypool and things like that. But but the fact is, he took advantage of the position that he was in to get himself lots of draft picks, and I'm sure that's something that had to appeal to Ben Johnson. And a name does not come to mind of the current hot head coaching position or person out there right now. But I just also feel like right now the Giants would be best with someone who's an experienced head coach already. And so we'll see. Belichick, I feel his time has come to ride off into the sunset, but there are a lot of other veteran coaches out there, and I think one of them might be the best choice right now for this team.
Absolutely. Tony, let's talk a little bit before we wrap it up. Let's talk a little bit about Jaxson Dart. Let's talk a little bit about the Giants quarterback situation. Okay. I do think the concussion that Jaxson Dart suffered on Sunday, that was inevitable. All right. He had been in the blue tent 2 other games. We'd seen him the end of last week's game, sort of, on the bench and in obvious pain toward the end of a game. And look, I get it. All right. There's no Malik Neighbors. There's no Cam Scatterbo. All right. But, and Jaxson Dart's a good runner. I get it. Okay. But there's a reason why I think, as a rookie quarterback, I think there was a number that I saw the other day about guys with like numbers of rushing touchdowns or whatever. And there's a reason why Jaxson Dart has 3 times as many rushing touchdowns as other rookie quarterbacks. It's because the Giants are running him too much. He's not 6'5" and 250 pounds like Josh Allen or like Ben Roethlisberger was. He's 6'2" and 220. Okay. And you can't You can't in the NFL use your quarterback as your primary running back. You just can't. You use him once in a while in spots as a runner. And I think we all saw the Jaxson Dart injury coming. He wasn't going to go through his career without an injury to begin with. But when you are and this is another reason, why we go back to Brian Daboll. It's another reason why you have to seriously look at whether Dable is the right guy. Look, Dable did this to Daniel Jones too. They ran Daniel Jones in 2022. And then in 2023, Daniel Jones got hurt. And then Daniel Jones comes back. And in the game that Daniel Jones comes back from the second serious neck injury of his career, on a 4th and 1 play, what does Brian Daboll do? Brian Daboll slams Daniel Jones into the middle of a couple 1,000 pounds of humanity head first on a quarterback sneak, trying to get a first down. That's not thinking about your player's best interests. And I just, it boggles the mind that you would take unnecessary risk with the future of your franchise. He's going to play the way he's going to play. And I love it. All right. I love it most of the time, but there are times to take advantage of that and times to figure out how to run block and hand the ball to Tyrone Tracy, or throw a screen pass or something else. So, but whoever follows Brian Daboll, or if it's Brian Daboll for the rest of the season, once Jaxson Dart clears concussion protocol, that has to change, even if it costs the Giants some points, because at this point, the thing that they have to do more than anything else is protect Jaxson Dart from himself and make sure that he doesn't become RG3.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. You can't protect Jaxson Dart completely. The guy, it's in his nature, right, to try to make a play. I mean, you can see that. You can see how ultra competitive he is. What you can do is severely limit the designed runs. There's nothing you can do about the scrambles, and that's one of the things that's making him so good is his scrambling ability, right? But you can cut down on the designed runs and not do that. I mean, the play he got hurt on, I believe, was a designed run. It was not a scramble, right? And yeah, you don't have to do that to him. But the thing I will add to that, though, is that I want to circle back to Joe Schoen. Why are they running so many designed runs with Jaxson Dart? And it's because they don't have receivers out there who can get open and catch the ball. And I feel like it's that not top of the roster, but middle to bottom of the roster, where Schoen hasn't given him enough weapons. And so Malik Neighbors goes down, and now you're saying, well, what can I do out there? They've got guys who are capable receivers, but the good offenses in the NFL have more than one top end receiver to them. Right? So the Dallas Cowboys, they already had CeeDee Lamb, who I would say that he's someone in the same category as Neighbors, but more experienced and better at this point. And what they do, they went out and got George Pickens, right? You look at the Green Bay Packers, who are coming in this Sunday, and they don't have any one guy who I think is as good as Neighbors, but they've got 3 or 4 guys who are really, I think, a very good wide receivers. I feel like this has been Patrick Mahomes' problem in Kansas City, that Brett Veach has not really given Mahomes the receivers that he needs ever since they got rid of Tyreek Hill. Now, maybe finally they've done it now that Xavier Worthy is back. But I feel like teams need a couple of real threats out there, to not just one. And when your number one goes down, who do you look to? And so I feel like Jaxson Dart is and Brian Daboll, because of all the designed runs, they're looking, saying, I don't know how we can move the ball with the guys we have on the field right now. And so I'm going to call Jaxson Dart's number. But if they keep on calling Jaxson Dart's number, then as you say, he's got a risk. He's got a risk of going the RG3 route. He's got a risk of going the Andrew Luck route, although the Andrew Luck route was mainly because of poor pass protection and how he took a beating behind the line of scrimmage. But you have a franchise quarterback. You've got to prioritize keeping that guy on the field and not letting him get injured.
Absolutely. Tony, last question before we sign off for the day. If Jaxson Dart does not clear concussion protocol this week in time to play against the Green Bay Packers, your head coach, who's your quarterback on Sunday?
Oh, definitely Jameis Winston.
Absolutely.
I already thought about that, and I feel bad for Russell Wilson a little bit, but he had his chance yesterday, and I realize it's a difficult situation to come into like that, but he had his chance yesterday, and he kind of showed that he can't really move the offense anymore.
There's just not a lot left there. There's just not.
Yeah. And Jameis Winston, my eyes are wide open about Jameis Winston. I mean, he's a thrill a minute. He will have as much chance of leading you downfield for the game-winning drive as he will of throwing the game-sealing interception to the other team. And we saw that. But Jameis Winston is someone who I think, and this is something Russell Wilson, I think, cannot do anymore. Jameis Winston can energize an offense. I think he's got the personality for it, and he's got the play style for it, right? Jameis Winston is not going to sit back there and just be content with handing the ball off 3 times. He's going to go for it, okay? And I think the rest of the offense will respond to him. Again, my eyes are wide open. I can imagine it's a disaster, and he throws 3 interceptions against Green Bay or something like that. But he's definitely the guy that I want out there on Sunday if Dart can't go.
Tony, you're fired. You stole my point. You stole what I was going to say. You're fired. I'm done.
We got to do something to make the game interesting on some.
Yes, absolutely. Right? I was going to make the same point about bringing some energy to a team that desperately needs it. And but anyway, but you did. So we're done.
Okay.
All right. I do actually think that's a good place for us to wrap it up. Giants fans, thank you as always for watching. Thank you for participating, dropping some comments in, giving us some things to think about and answer. And as always, please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.